I've been working now with probably around over 20 different clients at different levels of maturity relating to their adoption. And actually, before even getting to that, explaining a little bit about what I think adoption is, because I think that can be flavors for different audiences and different organizations. In my mind, when I'm talking about adoption, I'm thinking purely from the user point of view. We have a lot of technicians in Silver Sands who do a lot of really clever wizardry that I can't do, or I don't do because I'm not really talking about it from the point of view of the toggle or the configuration. I'm thinking about the business application, the use of it to support business outcomes and objectives, like I want to do something, therefore I use X to do it. I need to work with some partners outside the organization, I can use X to do it, and so on. So I'm thinking of this more from the user perspective than the technical. Like I say, we're backed up by, and I do a bit of a double act with a colleague where we do quite a lot of work to do a technical review followed by an adoption review, so that we really marry together a good state of the nation regarding the tech, as well as regarding the way that we're thinking about talking to the users. All of the clients that we're working with have gone through a sort of evolution. It's not a linear, it's not exact, and I'm hoping this might resonate with one or two of you. Either, and we did this with my old council, we did a license uplift to subscription away from enterprise license agreement, end of story, and our tech team turned it all on, and that's why I mentioned we had that interesting time for about 3 years to bring back control into some sort of governed environment. Other people had already looked at 365, had moved into subscription services, but had to accelerate activity around Teams, especially around COVID, and even now, as hybrid working starts taking hold, beginning to really expand and increase the use of Teams into a more BAU situation for you now. And the other part of the curve to that is that now we have organizations beginning to recognize the power of collaboration, communication, and productivity tools that Microsoft 365 gives us. What does that mean, excuse me, in terms of where our data is? So we're beginning to see a sort of a conveyor belt move towards urgent implementation and generally use by osmosis, followed by a recognition of the tool set and beginning to invest in some training, possibly very lightly, followed by a potential, I like the fact we can use Teams to hold all of our data. OneDrive and SharePoint could also be part of that mix, and we can start thinking about getting rid of some of our file shares to either return on investment for renewal of any hardware, or just generally the better working environment, accessed anywhere, anytime, from any device, subject to login control. So there's a number of things there. One is why you might have 365 in the first place, and number two, where you may be on your thinking about how much you want to make use of the platform. Now, before I get into the pillars, I'm just going to go through a little bit of a context of what some of the challenges are that I see with all of this. It's not rhetorical, it's not me thinking it, it's the experiences I have from working with quite a few local authorities, but also quite a few different sectors as well. I would say all of my clients have no complete business and technical strategy for 365. There's some really good technical leads saying they want to do X with 365 and they will do it over a period of 2 to 3 years time, and they have an idea they'd like to end up somewhere where everything's in 365, but they don't have the building blocks for it. And there are very few business strategies around how you want to manage your data, manage risk, manage access, consistent policies, advice and guidance, and available information for people to work safely and legally, and then marrying those two strategies together. I'd say absolutely none of my people I'm working with have them. They've all got good steps towards some of them, but they don't have it as a sort of an attitude as they may if it was an ERP, payroll, or HR system, or a social care app in my background of local government, which have usually a very good strategy attached to them. When we put Microsoft 365, and this is me totally in the old authority before I started working from the other angle, is putting in the tools before we really understand what the business need is from that technology, how to marry the features and the applications to business activities, even let alone business objectives and longer term business planning. 365 as a platform, excuse me, 365 as a platform is no longer the sole owner of technology. That can be true of ERP if you've got a payroll manager in the business and payroll system configurator team lead in the IT. And there again, the formal teams come together and they work really well. But we're noticing that 365 doesn't get that same level of attention. Now, I'll talk about the so what of this later on as to whether or not there's value in you needing to focus on these in the same way as a business tool for line of business. But I will just turn around. The only one I do, I've got a lot of examples, but the really good one is finance might ask us one day, how much is all of our licensing costing the organization and what benefit are we getting out in tangible business benefits? It's easy to turn a toggle on and off, but it's not easy to understand the risk that is attached to those toggles. And we have, again, I personal experience in my old job, as well as a number of customers, where the technical controls are felt to be applied, actually constrain the ability for the business to work. And in some cases, they're turning people away from the applications themselves. Understanding your users and the way they work, really understanding what 365 can do for their day job, how the applications and the features can match the type of jobs that they want to do, and also a recognition, once we've done this for a little while, like I have, that there is no one size fits all. And actually understanding your users and the way they work together as a one item is a really complex beast. Thinking about personas and scenarios, matrices, if you've gone to that level of introducing a really big ERP system. I was involved in the delivery of an SAP system. We needed those matrices. 365, do we need to do that first? My potential answer to that might be no, and you can, if you've got the teams that can do that. Again, we'll get into that in a bit more detail in a minute. Then finally, 365, overwhelming velocity of change. How do we manage that change? How do we communicate and educate the staff on that change? And how do we actually identify the change that needs to be communicated and or trained? Microsoft changed things daily, weekly, hourly, and even minutely if they were phrases. And I would struggle trying to put in the right type of change mechanism for 365 without filtering out some of the noise and understanding that actually their staff don't need to know that because it's too low level, and Microsoft will do it anyway, as opposed to a new app or feature. So what I've done over a number of years of almost following a process, this isn't linear, it's pick and mix, and it can be linear, and I've got some clients who have followed this all the way through. This is to say, addressing some of those challenges I've noticed with other organizations. If we start thinking about how are our staff currently feeling about 365, so this is attitudes, confidence and skills, and a maturity over their thinking of the use of Microsoft 365. Adoption audit is to look at your organization and understand what the gaps are between putting in a Microsoft 365 and potentially a line of business application you've put a lot of management and control over, and looking at the gaps and seeing how we could fill them so that 365 is given the same priority and emphasis within your organization as an application to deliver something like a procurement or financial or whatever else your line of business is. In order to support that adoption, where can people go for learning content? Somewhere reliable, somewhere persistent, somewhere repeatable, predictable, where they know they can go to find out something either about you as a company, the way you're using 365, or the way Microsoft 365 are developing their applications. We'll look a little bit at putting in a champion network and why they're very, very good ideas for Microsoft 365 if you haven't already got one for another line of business application. And then the last one for me is the key. It really brings together, it's a bit like the glue rather than the key, that brings together all the other principles and some others that I haven't included in today's session. So the first one I'm going to go into is skills audit. The only way in talking to a high number of organizations, and all of them will say, I don't know what my staff know, unless they've already done some type of digital skills or wider skills survey as part of their yearly staff well-being. My old council did incorporate some skills with their well-being, with their State of the Nation survey for how it felt to work for the council. And I've worked with a number of clients who incorporate skills in 365 in other surveys. If an organisation isn't overwhelmed by the number of surveys, and we have the luxury of running it, these are really comprehensive. They're scenarios within apps, they're scenarios of the use of the features. They look at the way people feel about and understand the way that they can be adapted within their day job. Sometimes it finds that there is no understanding of that principle. And it also talks about how they feel 365 has either helped them in their job or will help them. So it's a very comprehensive survey, and we can tailor it with our customers because not all organizations want to go to the depths that we identify. I really covered that one. We use a staff survey as a springboard to give you something straight away. If you know where your people are and you've got a good response to it, so it's not only 5 or 10 people out of 2,000, so you don't get a skew to understanding general problems and issues with 365, we can, out of this, without any other steps, start to build a training design for any problem areas we start to identify. That may be enough for you just to give you a kickstart with adoption, because you might not have done much training around Microsoft 365 already, and it can be done in silo. As I mentioned, all of these do fit together as a complementary building towards a managed, governed 365 environment. As a project manager of 4 years, it also gives me a baseline to evidence I've spent some money wisely, I hope. It allows me to say where everybody is today, and following some interventions for the next, say, 6 months or a year, or even a sprint for a couple of weeks to deliver some training to sort of see whether or not our method, our approach, and our type of delivery is useful to people. We can rerun the survey again at some point in the future and understand whether there's a movement, and we sort of work with clients to build up trackers so that they can get something to give to the business managers who are spending some money on their training investment. Have any of you thought about skills and addressing it in the way of a survey and understanding what your potential starting point would be for any training?
Yeah, so ironically, we send sort of our yearly IT survey, and about 85-90% are the answers they do not require extra training based on it, and then we get the feedback throughout the year that, hey, it'd be nice to know that. So there's definitely a little bit of miscommunication in terms of the feedback we're getting and what the actual business needs.
Yeah. While you're there, Ben, could I just ask, is that a fairly comprehensive survey from which you can glean what they do and what they don't do well, or is it fairly much, are you happy, are you okay, and do you feel you're getting sufficient training?
Yeah, no, so we're pretty comprehensive in terms of actually pinning down applications as well. So we'll mention, hey, are you happy with like, how do you think the apps, like the software's performing for you? So let's say, and let's just say the MC365 suite. How what's your feedback on that? And then, do you feel like you're able to use the system and functionalities comprehensively, or do you require more training? So yeah, we're pretty good in terms of what we're trying to get out of the users. They're just not as good as giving us the information back.
Yeah. Anyone else?
I'd probably add to that a little bit. I've tended not to use questionnaires or surveys, partly because of the speed and the need to act quickly, but also for that exact challenge of people don't really know what they don't know. The approach that I've come from is where, if you say take Teams as an application, how many people actually use Teams to even 50% of its capabilities? So if you start to look at the products, for me, it's the things that aren't being used and how people are adopting the technology to replicate how they traditionally used. And to give you an example of that, Teams is so powerful to change how people work, to actually embed the documentation within Teams, to add whiteboards in for brainstorming sessions, to add planner in to provide structure and project management within product teams. But people don't know that any of that's there. So if you say, how's Teams going? It's like, great, we can all video chat and, we communicate, we can work remotely. It's all good. But if you start to say, well, actually, have we changed how we're working to digitally enable more efficient and effective ways of working? That's been the delta that I've discovered, is the opportunity to drive improvements, but I don't think it lends itself to questionnaires so well.
Yeah.
Just so, can I ask a question though, Richard? Do you think that's because no one's taken the time to understand how the business handles day-to-day processes, and therefore no one's actually spotted how you could educate them to do their jobs more efficiently using Teams? Or
definitely, I think that's it. And I think my experience with M365 has been, as a platform, it's just incredible. But there's been almost no communication or information available around what it can do. It's almost like Microsoft have evolved O365 into M365 quietly and released all of this capability. And it's, my personal journey has been one of continually discovering the opportunities that it presents, and then looking at how you can, embed that into an organization to drive improvement. And I think that's, for me, the key, and part of the interest in this session was how do you start to do that reconciliation of the opportunity for the business that the technology now enables, and to bring those two together?
Yeah. Underneath this, when I talk about the skills audit, we also look at the statistics in the admin center in the technical side of 365. And if we work with an organization, one of the difficulties I have at the moment, this is just recognizing the current market forces, is very few people have sufficient staff to even do the upfront assessment of thinking of who the staff are, where they work, the type of work that they do, and the type of scenarios that we can match 365 features to help them do something differently. And a lot of the starting points for them has been a picture, whatever the picture is, it's understanding. So we use a staff survey if they want to and they're able to. We do a review of the admin center, the Power BI usage analytics that's available if you've got them turned on, where we can get into the depths of what the system is showing staff are doing. And we find that, and the ones we've been working with, we find that the survey has given them some color to some of those metrics. And that has allowed, with their support desk statistics about where their staff are phoning up a lot with their how do I calls, whether that goes to training or whether that goes to the IT service desk, it gives us and them a picture of where they can start to deal with the fundamentals. And at the moment, if I was really honest, Richard, we're still looking at the fundamentals. People are still finding that they're not getting beyond the what do I use, when and how. I don't know what you're finding in your organisations.
It's a really interesting challenge, isn't it? And, there's just so much potential in the platform. And yet, actually, people have largely been left to almost pick it up as they go.
Yeah.
I think back to COVID and remote working, actually, the implementation I was doing at the time, Teams was only put in place because we felt it would be harder to not implement it, because the owners of the business didn't want it. And of course, you suddenly went into lockdown and everyone was like, oh, thank God we've got Teams. But people started adopting it just for the perspective of video conferencing, and that whole journey to evolve how people could use it to change the way they were working to be more effective. It did feel, ironically, it felt product-led or technology-led rather than people-led. But the benefits were very, very people-orientated. And I think everything you said around, the admin center and the analytics is so helpful in starting to almost propose opportunities, albeit with the risk that, businesses never particularly like what they perceive as technology-led. Here's ways of working, here's how you can use technology differently.
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the things, before I move on to the next slide, I'm just conscious of time a little bit, but I would love to talk to you all afternoon, all of you. The one thing that I do identify with the informed training design, and that is a hugely small bullet that informs a massive springboard from here. And depending on where the organization is and where they've got skills already, if they were using 365 and they'd already started to deliver training and they'd already started to adopt before lockdown, they're obviously at a very different position because they may already know some of the what to use when and some of the basics. I'm talking to organizations where they haven't even got that. They don't even know they can add a tab to add a notebook to make it more flexible within the workspace and on, I mean, you and I probably know there's loads there. But yeah, the skills audit does look at the metrics. It does look at everything underneath to springboard that training kickstart. If an organisation is feeling they're in a hiatus, I'm not an advocate of doing something just to avoid doing nothing. Definitely not. But this gives people a springboard if they do feel that they have no understanding of where they are. It's a way in before they can start looking at some of the additional tools that they have available. I'm just going to pop on to the others. Quick move on. Just we can always come back to them at the end, and I always keep a bit of time at the end of these if anybody wants to carry on talking. I really enjoy that part of it. This little section here, in a way, for me, is a technique that I'm using with a large number of companies who have recognised that they deploy 365 without really thinking about it as a yet another good, well-managed business application. And that's where the apps have already gone out, 5,000 or whatever your user base is. Staff have started making use. As you mentioned, Richard, people have started learning by osmosis, either by being invited to a chat when COVID hit or invited to a meeting, and it's like, oh, I've got all these lovely tools and I can have a play while I'm listening to my manager tell me for my weekly update or whatever. But people have learned the things and they don't know enough about some of the bells and whistles that they could really take advantage of to do their job better. And the adoption audit is really, if you haven't already done it already, we make an assumption if you came in at this pillar, that somewhere you've done a skills assessment or you know a little bit about what the current use is and where you might like to be after a bit of education, communication and support. One of the ones that, and again, pure experience, nothing to do with making it up on the spot or anything, the rush to get 365 out, either supporting COVID or responding to COVID after they'd already deployed it, they made either a very, very fast job or no job at all of establishing what you should and shouldn't use where and when. Now, that could be the technical toggles enforcing a policy. And some organisations are very risk averse and they've put in a lot of toggles, but they've not really reviewed them afterwards. But then it's the business rules about when should I or shouldn't I share? When can I or can't I do something? And when must I or when must I not do something else? And it's really, as part of that starting point, is to say this is our starting foundation of putting in some control. And as I go through some of these, I get to the end of the operational model, you'll see a repeat around needing groups of people to do things repetitively and almost like a managed application. And this is the first start of test of that. So where are our rules? Whatever they are, where are they? And can we put a hand on them? And do we tell our staff about them? Or do we wait until they get up against a blocker that stops them using a feature and then they go and find some other way of doing it? Traditionally, I found that's a really easy one. If I can't share from my OneDrive, I'll go and use Dropbox. Really controversial statement, and I've come across that many times since I've been in Silver Sands, where people feel so constrained they've had to find another way, and the other way is normally less safe than if they'd enabled the feature. Identify training and communication methods traditionally, and I'm like I say, I'm always coming back to myself, so you know I'm not preaching. We tried to fill a gap on training, and one or two organisations I work with now are trying to fill the gap on training and comms by IT doing it all. One organisation I've worked with all the way along these pillars, actually, their IT training lead, I think is probably the best way, wasn't even a manager. They were trying to fulfil all the training and communication for 365 themselves and the team of two. They were overwhelmed, underpaid, all of the other things, but they were finding it a real struggle because they had no foundation on which to think about it. And yet you have big business teams set up to look at either a line of business app or a finance system or an HR system. And there are people identified to support the training and comms for either changes to applications or the plugging in of a new module or enabling of a new app functionality. And yet the 365 team were all feeling overwhelmed in a very small team. Identify
just to stop you there, just one question. Just out of interest, how big was the company size?
That was about 4,500. That was a government organisation, and that was a really, really good case study in our help with them, because in a way they were replicating the same mistakes I had in the council, and we because of the work I've done with a number of clients, and also recognising in our first iteration in the council, the 365 wasn't as well released. And the second time we had a chance to, when we brought the councils together in Dorset to relaunch 365 properly, we put in quite a few of those steps, and that was a really large organisation. The smaller the organisation, obviously, the easier to understand the training and comms methods. Normally it's one person, if it's even a whole role. The support arrangements, that's really critical to making sure that the support team that may or may not have been additionally funded to take on 30 odd new applications are able to and are capable of supporting the break fix and the technical, and understanding whether or not the how do I should be going somewhere else. And traditionally, service desks would normally deal with as much as they can at level 1 and absorb the work without really thinking, is the service desk the right place for people to go to for 365 calls? And I'll talk a little bit about self-reliance in a minute as a potential culture shift towards another way of doing support. And then out of that, we would design a training and communication plan to address the immediate and longer term training needs. Now, that would be a little bit more formal than the one if we did it with you in a skills assessment, or you did it purely based on a skills and a metrics review in its isolation. This will be a little bit more detail, incorporating all the different channels that you may be able to do communication and training methods to. And it gives you a little bit more of a way to deliver over the long term, reviewing your skills after each intervention, making sure that people are learning and you're evidencing where they're learning. And you can almost have an adoption plan over a period of time to deliver different levels of capability to different types of people, depending on their skills in particular business areas. I'm going to move on to Learning Portal. And again, I'm just being very conscious of the time. I'm just going to move on a little bit. One of the things I mentioned is that in understanding skills, understanding behaviours of people and the use of 365, one size no longer fits all. Absolutely. The other thing we're recognising as I talk to, I'd say 80% of the people I work with, nobody's getting any more funding to deliver training and support on 365. They just haven't had the money. They haven't had the ability or the agility to be able to refocus staff onto 365 for a while to give it a really good foundation. They are trying to squeeze as much as they can out of the people they're already having to use for their training internally, whatever their system and IT and skills training are. And then 365 is yet another annoyance is the wrong word, but that's how people feel. So one of the things we talk about is to work with businesses to explore the case for self-reliance. Now, if I tell everybody tomorrow 365 training is found on a portal here, they're not going to go there if they don't feel that there's something in it for them. You can tell them, and the one or two may get it, but the rest will, who are used to getting their support from wherever they do now, will still go there, whether it's a service desk, whether it's a trainer, whether it's the person who talked to them about it when it first got implemented, like me. I used to get calls all day, every day on it. It's understanding that self-reliance does need a conversation with senior management, because if the senior management don't agree and approve, the staff won't feel empowered to look for their own answers sometimes. And the more that we get the support at the senior level, and the more that's distributed down through the organisation, the more we can start to influence the bottom up, that we can start saving some of our support desk time by not answering so many calls, pointing them to the resources we have available, and knowing the resources are current and relevant. So we would identify with you the channels that you currently use to deliver training and communications, and we will look to see what we could do for a single portal that could deliver training, both from Microsoft, so you don't have to update it every time they change an app or a feature, and also of your own content, so that when you do deliver specific training, we have a central location for all of that material. And that we can use the portal for communication. So what's going on with 365? What changes are coming? Have a change landing page. Have a training and events and promotion area where you can tell people what you're doing. If we work with one or two of our customers who have the resources to do regular roadshows with Microsoft 365, put things out on there for people to book onto, like these events where they can come and find out informally, buy little nuggets, coffee shop visits, that sort of thing, where you can start the conversation to bring 365 up in the agenda of the organisation. that it's part of the conversation rather than a specific training event that people have to go to. And then we would work, if you wanted us to help you with something like this, we would implement a pilot, and Microsoft proposed two products, one included with licenses and one, depending on the capability you wanted, some additional costing. But they would give you really out-of-the-box solutions that you could then tailor for your own organization and establish yourself something immediately that could support any other training that you've got going on. Linked to this, exploring the case for self-reliance is also understanding that people learn from each other as much as they do from formal or semi-formal training. And I've just done a survey with one organisation, and the people I work with to set up the whole approach that we're talking about today said that the people don't like learning on their own. They want classroom, they demand classroom, and they will not learn any other way. And yet the results on the survey were actually classroom was the third approach. The first one was learning from others, and the second one was giving a go for myself. And in a way, it turned it on its head in the way that they want to approach the way they got information out about using a product. What we tend to find is that when people have put in champion networks and they have got the case right for networks so that managers allow champions to spend time on champion activities, it will reduce the strain on a central project or training team. For me, that's the way of bringing life into the way I want to work, talking to somebody who knows the way I work. It's great, I've got someone who's skilled up on 365 in the central training team, but they're never going to know every single team and every single way that we want to use an application. And when OneDrive does not have to be used the same way, as long as it's safe and legal, I want to be able to have somebody I can just bounce ideas off who knows the product, who knows what's safe and legal, and then we can work out ways of doing it together. But I need that extra little bit of support because I might not be quick enough or agile enough in my mind to see how 365 could bring those new ways of working. And Richard mentioned about the multitude of different capabilities that staff are nowhere near using yet. And that's where I find champions can really, once they've been given a bit of upskilling and a bit of confidence sometimes to be real champions, they can work with the team to identify the scenarios that really solve business challenges. And again, if the safe and legal has been sorted in the governance and the business rules, the champions are then free to start exploring how to make the applications. I'm going to sound euphoric, and I don't mean it like that, but how to bring them alive and how almost to sing and dance with the team. Because the thing that we find with staff looking at the way 365 could work for them, because they don't know what they don't know, you've mentioned that already, they can't start to use the applications in ways that really could transform the way they work. Champions also give us 365-degree feedback and allow us to get information on how people are using the applications and features, and it can also supplement other ways of finding out through either surveys or other feedback loops what our future training needs are. So it gives us another how do I level of support to staff. Can I just pause there and just see, has anyone got champion networks already established?
Not here, no.
No. Have you thought about it, Ben? Is it something that's...
So something we previously had when we went our first ever SharePoint migration on the intranet, and worked well in some teams, but not good uptake in others. And it was all time dependent on the business champions for the departments. But something I think I'm probably going to revisit in the early year, because I spoke with Colin actually last week about this.
Anyone else? The two Richards?
Previously put change networks in place, but not in the last couple of years. So yeah, it's an interesting kind of to think about whether it would apply, particularly in product aligned teams, but it's not something we've got at the moment.
No, I think it's something we've had in the past, but we don't have anything at the moment. We kind of have a user forum but not just for 365, for kind of any IT issues. I'd agree that the kind of getting it kind of evenly distributed across the organization is a bit of a challenge, that you tend to have you're not necessarily reaching the people that you want to reach.
Yeah, I'm working with a couple who are all thinking about starting, and there's a very big imbalance across some functions that are very well represented, and within those functions, the champions that have volunteered are very well. They're the type of people, and I shouldn't discount, because anybody can be developed with the appropriate training and support from a champion lead. But also you find that the organisation manages support. If it's not really there, the staff aren't going to feel it either. And that's where I always put the case for self-reliance at the top when working with a new client that would like to explore, is actually what is the case. And the case is very, very rarely pure financial, because it's very hard to put a pound and pence value to the value of a champion. But in terms of influence and skills and reducing support teams centrally, the logic of that can normally go through the first pitfall of, if it's not going to save me X number of pounds per year, I'm not really interested. Then the spread is really just going out to the organisation. In our experience, volunteers give you the best champions, and they can be trained if they're missing any of the techniques you'd like them to have. And really just carrying on around the organisation until you get the good spread. We have found recently, and this is just a bit of a, this has worked for only two, so I'm not going to say it's going to work for everybody, but where they're beginning to do a SharePoint migration, the SharePoint site owners are mandated for every team to reduce the central burden for data and information records management. And we have found that actually the site owner role, giving it some champion responsibility, as is giving them the spread across the organisation that we haven't otherwise seen before. And I think they're getting near 99% spread of a champion influence. How much that carries on once they realise how much they'd like to put on them relating to the other apps, I don't know. But for me, it was a bit of a win. Excuse me.
I was just going to say, Andy, the other thing is you need to actively manage your champions network in terms of giving those champions the incentive and the motivation to engage with your network. In other words, publish agendas that are relevant to them, topics they'll want to turn up at, things they're interested in, because that way it just drives that whole self-reliance piece across the business.
Yeah. Absolutely. The one example I'm working with at the moment, a local authority, they've put a lot of effort into their champion team. We've been doing it for about a year. And I just sort of sit on their body as a sort of a mentor, that we can just spawn ideas, bounce ideas. They just have a couple of hours a month, and they're really driving it. But one of the recognitions that the project manager really asked me if I could come up with some way of financially evidencing the power of a champion. It is difficult, and he's worked with me for the subsequent 3 or 4 months. And he's now completely on board, and he's going back to the senior change program about the value of champions, whereas he was a sort of a skeptic. If it wasn't evidence in pounds and pence, he wasn't really interested. So there are challenges to champion networks, and I think ongoing management, they will fizzle out. He's recognised they will fizzle if he doesn't have a leader, which he has got. Luckily, he's got a very committed one. The last pillar I wanted to talk about today is really, in a way, it's the glue, but also for organisations, it may be the first time some have thought about it following a whatever reason for deployment of 365. I've worked in central government in a very strong ITIL managed IT environment, or business environment as well. Very disciplined around ITIL. Very disciplined around the general service management principles, if you haven't heard of ITIL, and also very dogmatic, if I was honest, around management of risk and management of projects as well. So I've worked on the very structured and dogmatic organisations, and I've worked down to the ones that need to be a lot more agile because you've got a lot less staff to work in. This is a model that I like to talk about because it brings together the roles that we've been discussing. And it also introduces to some organisations for the first time the need to do it to 365 if you want to get really good return on investment. Because if we don't start putting some control around the way we look after 365 as a business tool, how are we going to get really the returns on that licensing that we're paying for? Especially if you are interested in Copilot and stop your eyes watering at the potential cost it might be, but still feel it might be for you. I'm still working with clients now where the organizations aren't really saying how much are we spending on licenses, but they're expecting it, and they're beginning to talk to us about how can we provide return on investment figures to the way we work. So operational management, it's really high level. This is just to say, pulling together a lot of what I said. What is Microsoft 365? It is a platform, and historically, everyone we work with is an IT tool. Very little business involvement, saying, I think of it as a business tool, therefore I want to do X, Y, and Z with it. We get some business governance where people start to identify the risks that could be involved in the way of working in the cloud, and they're beginning to start putting some controls around the business governance. But I'm thinking more about what is your business plan, what is your organizational plan, and what are your functional plans, and how could 365 as a tool begin to address some of those. And a really practical one, I've got about 2 organizations have really picked up on this and implemented it recently, is an M365 strategy. M365 first, every purchase or every renewal of every third-party bit of software, we will do a brief assessment with 365, and where 365 could do 80% of its features, we will not go and buy that new app, or we will not go and renew that license. I'm sure there'll be exceptions, but it's a really nice starting point for them to see, I have saved X by not buying this because 365 can do it, and I'm already paying quite a lot of money for my licenses. Also, business objectives in terms of how I want to collaborate with my partners, my citizens, if I'm a council, or the people I work with regularly, like the NHS or other big stakeholders, where we could set up objectives to collaborate a lot more effectively using the tools than we do any other way at the moment. Success measures, so we can see Microsoft 365 is changing the way we work. And the Microsoft 365 plan. And this is, again, very quick run through of something which obviously is massively complicated, or it can be. But we tend to find that terms of reference, identifying the management plan that we want to put over 365 is really worthwhile, because then we're not overlapping and underlapping similar or other bodies around the organization, certainly around risk, certainly around change, where you might have established good change and risk management practices, but you haven't thought about incorporating it with Microsoft 365, and then identifying roles and responsibilities within that plan for who's involved in the group and how you deliver effective management. And the way I'm going to do it visually. The grey are environmental impacts, internally or externally to your company. Everything within the blue circle is a team that I've been talking either explicitly or implicitly. So communications and training and support on the right, where we're talking about the support to the end users and the channels that they have to get the information. And then the controls and the direction of travel. So security, compliance and strategy that affect and deliver something to IT to give to the users in a way that is configured safely and legally. And then we have just some ideas around the outside that we could test the model against ad infinitum. One of the ones I like to talk about, and I've got one organisation painfully realising how bad this could be for them if they hadn't put in something like this. They put in a very cut down version, is if they want to merge, they want to separate one team into two and disaggregate the data between one very secure and sensitive group that have been split off and the rest of the team. And where they've had one bucket of stuff in SharePoint and Teams, they're now having to work out what they need to do. And the original plan was to migrate on a Monday, as in last Monday. And they only asked the Friday before, how do we separate the data between our teams? And there was very little awareness of a group that they'd started to put together where they could have dealt with all of those questions around the data security, the data residency, and all of that lot. So that's a really nice to see you, Richard. And that is, in a snapshot, the sort of controls that we like to put around with Microsoft 365, as if it was a line of business application, so that it gets same attention at the business level as your other big applications. Well, I'm just gonna, for the last couple of seconds, really I just realised I've gone up to 2 minutes too, but that's a summary of these slides. There's no new information in those bullets. Any thoughts?
I think this has been really helpful, by the way, so thank you for hosting this. I always thought these sessions are really helpful. The only thoughts from me is I think the champion program just highlights again, even after discussion with Colin last week, that we should probably look to try and pivot back to that and really drive the adoption.
Mm.
Yeah, like I'm hoping that, you know, this will give you some ideas in terms of areas you could look at yourselves, to try and, you know, just maybe revisit what you've already been before, maybe some new ideas in terms of extra things you could try.